Harlem, 1953. A mobster burned Bumpy Johnson and walked away smiling in front of 12 witnesses. No screams, no gunshots, just humiliation, pressed into the room like smoke. To understand why Harlem never forgot that night, you have to go back to the table where it all began. The smell reached you before the doors even opened. Bleach, burnt flesh, something underneath both of them, sweet and wrong. The kind of smell that gets into your throat and stays there for days. The kind of smell you don't forget, no matter how long you live or how hard you try. Bellevue Hospital, East Corridor, 4:47 in the morning. The ward was quiet, not the quiet of an empty room. The quiet of people who knew something they weren't going to say. Nurses moved faster than they needed to. An orderly mopped the same square of floor twice without noticing. A doctor wrote in a chart and kept his eyes down. In the third bed from the door, a man lay still. He was big. Even flat on his back, you could see it wide shoulders, thick hands, a chest that rose and fell slow and steady, like a man who had made a decision somewhere between the street and this room. The decision to not let anyone see him struggle. His face told a different story. The left side had been destroyed. The skin from his temple down past his cheekbone was burned open tight in some places, raw and wet in others. The color of something that should not be visible outside the human body. His left eye was swollen completely shut. His ear had lost its shape. The gauze the nurses had wrapped around his head was already bleeding through at the edges, slow and dark. A nurse who had worked emergency for 11 years checked his chart at 5 a.m. She walked back to the station, sat down, and stared at the wall for a full minute before she wrote anything. She had never seen burns like that on a conscious man. He was conscious. That was the part that had made the ward go cold. He didn't scream when they cleaned the wound, didn't ask for more morphine, didn't call out for anyone. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling with the one eye that still opened and said nothing for 6 hours straight. The chart read, John Doe. No identification. No next of kin. The official record, what little exists of it, tells only that much. The rest lives in the memory of people who were there and never spoke publicly about what they saw. 2 men had carried him through the doors at 4:30 a.m., set him on the gurney, walked back out into the dark before the night clerk could get a name. By the time anyone thought to follow them outside, the street was empty. By 6 a.m., word was already moving through Harlem. Not through phones, not through newspapers, through the specific silence of men who passed each other on the sidewalk, made eye contact for half a second, and kept walking. That was how information moved in this neighborhood. And it moved fast. A man had been burned, brought in before dawn, no name on the chart. In Harlem in 1953, that combination only meant one thing. A law had been broken. Not the law downtown, not the kind with courtrooms and judges. The other law. The one that didn't get written down because everyone already knew it. The one that had been keeping a particular kind of peace in this neighborhood for years. In this world, injury was never an accident. A broken hand was a warning. A cut face was a message. Burns deliberate, focused. The kind that took time and someone who wasn't in a hurry. That was a declaration. That was one party telling another party something that couldn't be unsaid. The ward understood this without anyone explaining it. The orderly mopped the floor a third time. The doctor finished his chart and left the corridor without looking back. The nurse crossed herself in the hallway when she thought no one was watching. At 9 a.m., a man in a gray coat came through the front entrance of the hospital. He didn't speak to anyone at the desk. He walked to the east corridor, stood at the far end, looked toward the third bed for about 4 minutes, then turned around and left. By noon, Harlem knew that Bumpy Johnson had been told, and Harlem went quiet in a way that was different from normal quiet. The man in the third bed turned his head toward the window, outside. The sky had gone from black to gray to a pale flat blue. A delivery truck moved through the street below, somewhere down the block. A dog barked twice and stopped. The city was waking up and doing what the city always did, moving. Breathing. Pretending nothing had happened. His right hand lay flat on the sheet. Fingers still. Not relaxed. Still. There is a difference between a man who has let something go and a man who is holding something in. One looks like rest. The other looks like this. He was holding something in. The ceiling was white and water-stained and had nothing to say. He stared at it anyway. Outside. Harlem moved through its morning. But underneath the noise of it, underneath the traffic and the voices and the ordinary sound of people going about their lives, something else was running. A frequency too low to hear but impossible to ignore if you knew what you were feeling for. The way a storm announces itself in your bones before the sky changes color. The ward felt it. The street felt it. Everybody felt it. Something was being built in the silence of a man who refused to scream. 3 days before that hospital bed, the room had been full of cigarette smoke and the smell of chicken going cold on plates nobody touched. 126th Street, a restaurant with no sign outside and no empty tables on any night that mattered. Dark wood, low light, the kind of place that existed because the right people had decided it existed. The kitchen was real. The food was real. But nobody had come here tonight to eat. This was a sit-down. In the world of organized crime in 1950s New York, a sit-down was not a meeting. It was a proceeding. It had rules, the way a courtroom had rules unwritten, unspoken, but understood by every man who took a chair at the table before he sat down. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't make a threat. You couldn't back up with something real. You didn't disrespect the room. The room was the point. Bumpy Johnson came in at 7 p.m. with 2 men behind him. He had been navigating this particular arrangement, Harlem's numbers operation, running alongside the Genovese family's broader network for nearly 15 years by then. Federal surveillance files from the period would later confirm the structure of it, though they captured the ledger, never the room. He was 45 years old, heavy through the shoulders, slow in his movements the way powerful men are slow not because they can't move fast, but because they've learned that moving slow makes other people nervous in useful ways. He wore a dark suit and kept his hat on. He ordered coffee and didn't drink it. The Genovese family had sent Vincent. Vincent was 30 years old and had the specific confidence of a man who had been told too many times that he was sharp. Good suit. Good shoes. The kind of face that smiled when it shouldn't. He sat across the table from Bumpy and spread his hands and started talking about territory. The numbers operation on the west side of Harlem had been growing. Revenue was up. And Vincent's position laid out carefully, with the tone of a man who considered himself reasonable, was that the current arrangement no longer reflected what the operation was actually worth. It wasn't a bad argument, technically. Bumpy listened, both hands flat on the table, eyes on Vincent's face. Expression showing nothing, not agreement, not disagreement, not impatience, just attention, steady and unblinking. The kind that starts to feel uncomfortable after the first minute and unbearable after the 5th. Vincent kept talking. He was on his second major point, somewhere in the middle of a sentence about percentage structures, when he made the mistake. He leaned forward, and he put his hand on Bumpy's arm. Not a grab. Not a strike. A hand. Placed on the forearm of Bumpy Johnson, at a formal table, in front of 12 men who all understood in the same instant exactly what had just happened. The room stopped. No one moved. No one spoke. No chair scraped the floor. The kitchen sounds from 20 feet away, pots, voices. The hiss of something on a flat grill suddenly seemed very far away. The smoke from 3 different cigarettes rose straight up in the stillness because nothing in the room was moving enough to disturb it. Bumpy looked down at the hand on his arm. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. long enough for every man at that table to count them. Then he looked up at Vincent. He said nothing. Vincent felt it. You could see it happen. The shift moving through his body from his hand upward, the moment his nervous system registered what his confidence had just walked him into. His hand came back to his side. His voice, when he continued, had dropped half a register. He finished his argument. Got to the end of it. Stopped talking. Bumpy said, "I'll think about what you've said." He stood up, put on his hat, walked to the door and out of it. His two men followed. The door closed. The room stayed silent for another 5 seconds after the sound of the car outside had faded. Then one of the Genovese men turned and looked at Vincent. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. "You touched him." 3 words. Flat. No anger in them, which somehow made them worse. Just the recording of a fact. The noting of something that was now part of the permanent record of this evening and could not be removed from it. Vincent sat with what he had done. The food on the plates had gone completely cold. The smoke from the cigarettes had nowhere to go. Outside on 126th Street, a car horn sounded twice and went quiet, and the city continued being the city. Indifferent to the specific disaster that had just been made at a table inside a restaurant with no sign above the door. Nobody at that table slept easily that night, but only one of them understood, with the full weight of genuine fear, what the next 72 hours were going to mean. Bumpy Johnson did not go home that night. He went to a back room on 118th Street small, plain, a table and 2 chairs and a lamp with a low bulb that turned everything amber. A window that looked onto an alley where a cat was picking through something near the wall. He sat down. Someone brought him a glass of water and left without being asked to. He sat alone and he thought, not about whether to respond. That was already decided the moment Vincent's hand touched his arm. In this world, that question didn't exist. The only question was how. And how was everything? He lit a cigarette, didn't smoke it, let it burn down between his fingers while he ran the numbers in his head. Not money numbers, the other kind. The kind that told you what an action cost against what it bought. The kind of calculation that separated men who lasted in this business from men who didn't. People who studied him later, and some did, carefully. In files that took decades to surface noted this about Johnson specifically, that he was not a man who acted from anger. He was a man who used anger the way a carpenter uses a level, to check whether something was straight, and then set it down. He was setting it down now. Option 1 was fast. Find Vincent tonight or tomorrow morning and make the response immediate and loud. Send a message that landed hard and left no room for interpretation. He rejected it in under a minute. Fast looked like panic. A man who retaliates the same night is a man who got rattled, a man who grabbed for the first answer because he was scared of what waiting would say about him. Harlem was watching. The families were watching. Being scared was the one thing he couldn't afford to look. Option 2 was nothing. Absorb it. Let it go. Move on. He didn't spend time on that one. 12 men had been in that room. 12 sets of eyes that had seen what they'd seen and were already talking to 12 other sets of ears. A man who took what Vincent had done and did nothing was a man who could have it done to him again. And again. Until the arrangement that had held Harlem together for 15 years came apart at the seams, and everything it had been holding in place came down with it. That left option 3. Something precise. Something that landed in the right place with the right weight and said exactly what needed to be said to exactly the people who needed to hear it without starting a war that Harlem couldn't afford to fight. Because that was the 3rd number in the calculation, and it was the biggest one. A full conflict with the Genovese family meant blood on streets that didn't belong to either of them. It meant operations shut down. Money stopped. The small businesses and numbers runners and ordinary people in this neighborhood caught in the middle of something they hadn't caused and couldn't stop. Bumpy had seen what that looked like. He had been in this city long enough to know who actually paid the price when two organizations decided to stop being careful with each other. It was never the men at the table. He was not going to let it be a war, but the response had to be real. It had to be felt. It had to reach past Vincent, who was a symptom, not the disease, and land against the structure itself. Had to say, clearly, to the Genovese family and to everyone watching from every direction, this is where the line is. This is what happens when you cross it. This is not a negotiation. The cigarette had burned all the way down. He looked at the ash, outside the window. The cat in the alley had found what it was looking for and gone quiet. Somewhere further away, a woman was arguing with someone in a building above the street, her voice rising and falling, words indistinct, just the shape of anger traveling through walls and glass. The city at 3 a.m. doing what it always did. By the time the lamp had been on for 4 hours, Bumpy had the outline of it. Not every detail. Details took time and the right conversations with the right people. But the shape was there, solid, specific, proportionate, an action that would close this chapter without opening a worse one. He stood up. His knees ached in the cold. He was not a young man, and this room was not warm. He put on his coat and looked at the table, the water glass, the dead cigarette, the amber light, and then he walked to the door. He had 72 hours. He was going to use all of them, outside. 118th Street was dark and cold and smelled like winter coming in off the river. His breath showed in the air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the sky, no stars, cloud cover low and flat, the orange glow of the city bouncing back down from above. Then he started walking. Harlem didn't know yet what was coming, but it would. In 72 hours, it would know exactly where the lines were. And nobody, not Vincent, not the Genovese family, not anyone watching from any direction was going to forget it. The basement on 114th Street had no windows, no street number, and a door built to look exactly like the wall around it. You pressed a specific brick at shoulder height and the whole panel swung inward. Cold air came out when it opened, the smell of damp stone and heating oil and something older underneath. The accumulated cold of a room that had been holding secrets for a very long time. Bumpy came in first. He always came in first. 15 years in this city had built that habit into his bones. You arrived before the other man. You chose your chair. You controlled the geometry of the room before the conversation started. He took the chair nearest the door and sat with his coat still on and his hands resting on his knees. The single bulb overhead turned everything the color of old newspaper. Sal Moretti arrived 4 minutes later. He was 61 years old and carried himself like a man who had burned off every unnecessary thing decades ago and kept only what worked. Small frame, gray temples, a face built for concealment. He sat down across from Bumpy without extending his hand, without any greeting at all, and looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a body, not with feeling, with precision. He had carried a small cup of espresso in from somewhere. He drank half of it, set it on the floor between his feet. Then he said, "Vincent put his hand on the wrong man." "Yes," Bumpy said. "That's not what I came to talk about." "I know." The boiler behind the wall fired up with a heavy clank and a low roar, and then settled into a steady vibration that moved through the floor and into the legs of both chairs. Above them, through the ceiling. Footsteps crossed a room and stopped. Sal leaned forward slightly. "There are men on my side who have been watching Harlem for 2 years. They use the word inefficient." He said the word the way you say a word you've heard too many times in bad contexts. What they mean is they want a reason, not a good reason, just a reason they can put on a table in front of other people and point at. Bumpy said nothing. He was already ahead of this. "Vincent gave them the opening," Sal continued. What you do next determines whether the opening closes or widens. Here was the thing that Bumpy had been sitting with since the night of the sit-down, the thing beneath the obvious thing, the structure beneath the surface. Historical records from that period document the Genovese family's method of expanding control across Upper Manhattan: create or allow a disruption, wait for an overreaction, then arrive with reorganization already planned. It had worked before. The disruption was always someone else's. The reorganization always benefited the same people. Sal was telling him this because Sal had watched it happen to other neighborhoods and didn't want to watch it happen here. "If I do nothing," Bumpy said, "Harlem reads it as weakness. My own people stop believing the lines are real." "Yes." "If I respond too hard, your people use it as the reason they've been building toward." "Yes." "So the question is where the edge is." Sal picked up the espresso, found it cold, drank the rest anyway, and set the cup back on the floor with a small ceramic sound that was very loud in the silence of the room. "I have spent 15 years, he said, and his voice was quieter now but heavier, telling certain people that this arrangement is worth protecting, that Harlem is stable, that you are— he paused and chose the word carefully— consistent. He looked at Bumpy without blinking. "If you do something that makes that argument impossible to keep making, I cannot protect it, and I want you to understand what gets built in its place." Not a threat. Sal Moretti had not survived 61 years by threatening people. He delivered information the way a doctor delivered a diagnosis, completely, without softening it, and then let you make your own decision about what to do with it. Bumpy sat with it, let it move through him fully so there was nothing left to surprise him later. "Vincent needs to understand what he did," he said. "Agreed. In a way that ends the question, not extends it." Sal stood up slowly, the way men with old knees stand up in cold rooms. He buttoned his coat from the bottom button up, which was a habit Bumpy had noticed before and never mentioned. He looked at Bumpy one final time, full attention, both eyes, the look of a man making sure he has read something correctly before he walks away from it. "That," he said, "is why I came myself." He found the brick at shoulder height. The door swung open. Cold air moved into the room and Sal Moretti walked out into it, and the door swung shut behind him and disappeared back into the wall. Bumpy sat alone. The bulb hummed overhead. The boiler pushed heat through the pipes with a sound like knuckles cracking. Slow and deliberate. The heating oil smell had gotten thicker. Or maybe he was just noticing it more now that the room had only one person in it. He had come into this basement with a plan. He was leaving with the same plan, but now he understood its full dimensions in a way he hadn't when he walked in. The permission and the warning were the same thing wearing different faces. Cross the line in one direction and Harlem broke from the inside. Cross it in the other and it broke from the outside. The only path was straight through the middle, and the middle required absolute control of every decision from this moment until it was finished. Bumpy stood up. His knee ached from the cold in the hard chair. He turned off the lamp and stood in complete darkness for 2 seconds, letting his eyes adjust to nothing, before he moved toward the door. 2 seconds of nothing. Then he pushed the brick and walked out into the street, and the cold hit him clean and sharp, and he started moving. He had work to do and not much time to do it in. The Hudson River smelled like rust and dead fish and diesel fuel and cold so deep it got into your lungs and stayed there. Pier 57 in November, at 11 at night, was not a place anyone went voluntarily. The planking was rotten through in sections, soft and black underfoot, the kind of soft that meant the wood was one hard step from giving way entirely. At the far end sat the warehouse, its upper windows broken out years ago, the wind moving through the gaps and making a sound that was almost human, a low, cycling moan that rose and fell with the gusts off the water. Inside, one work lamp hung from a ceiling beam on a length of wire, yellow light, barely enough to see by. the kind of light that made everything look like it was already a memory. The river slapped the pilings underneath the whole structure, slow and rhythmic, like something patient waiting for the wood to finally give up. Bumpy arrived at 10:40. His 2 men were already inside, standing against opposite walls beyond the reach of the lamp. They didn't move when he came in. They didn't speak. They stood absolutely still in the dark edges of the room and breathed and waited. Vincent arrived at 11:12, 32 minutes late, which meant he had stood somewhere and thought about not coming, had weighed the options with real fear, and decided that not showing up was worse than showing up. He came alone, which meant the Genovese family had been told about this meeting and had decided not to interfere, which meant Sal had made a call after leaving the basement on 114th Street. Bumpy had expected that. Vincent walked the pier in a good coat and wrong shoes, leather-soled, slipping on the wet black wood, grabbing a piling with both hands at one point to keep from going down into the planking. He got to the warehouse door and came through it, and the cold air from the river followed him in and made the lamp swing once on its wire. He looked at the 2 shapes standing in the dark at the walls. He looked at Bumpy standing near the light. His face was working hard. It was doing everything a face can do to look like it isn't afraid, and it was failing at all of it. The jaw was set too tight. The eyes were moving too much. His hands hung at his sides with the fingers spread slightly, the unconscious posture of a man who wants to be ready for something and doesn't know what shape it's going to take. "Close the door," Bumpy said. Vincent closed it. The river sound dropped to a murmur. The lamp steadied. The warehouse smelled like river rot and old iron and the specific cold sourness of a building that had been absorbing bad nights for 30 years. Bumpy let the silence sit for 10 full seconds. 10 seconds in that room, in that light, with 2 men you couldn't see clearly standing in the dark behind you. 10 seconds was enough to make a man's imagination do most of the work. Then Bumpy started talking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke in the same level tone he used for everything for business, for instruction, for the rare occasions when he explained to someone exactly what was going to happen to them and why. He talked about the table on 126th Street. He talked about what a sit-down meant and what the rules of it were, and what happened to the entire architecture of this world when someone decided the rules didn't apply to them. He talked about the 15 years of work that had kept a particular arrangement functioning, and the number of people whose daily lives depended on that arrangement not breaking. He talked about what it cost when someone tested it in public, in front of witnesses, with his hand. Vincent tried to say something twice. Both times Bumpy continued as if the room were empty except for himself. When he finished, he was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he nodded once to the man on the left wall. What happened in the next 30 minutes was not written down anywhere, which was by design. What the hospital chart would record at 4:50 a.m. was the outcome, the physical documentation of a message that had been composed over 72 hours and delivered with surgical precision on a rotting pier above the Black Hudson River. Vincent did not die at Pier 57. That was the decision Bumpy had made in the back room on 118th Street and confirmed in the basement on 114th Street. Vincent would leave. He would walk out of this warehouse on his own 2 feet, or close enough to his own 2 feet, and he would live and he would carry tonight with him for every year he had left. Because a dead man is a closed subject, a living man who has to go back to his people, who has to be looked at, who has to sit in rooms where everyone knows what happened to him, and no one says it out loud. That man is a message that keeps being delivered. Every time someone looks at his face, every time he walks into a room and people notice, every time he looks in a mirror. The river kept slapping the pilings. Patient, indifferent. The lamp cast its yellow light over everything and said nothing. Bumpy walked out at 12:23 a.m. The cold hit him instantly, clean and brutal. the kind of cold that made your eyes water whether you were sad or not. He stood on the pier and looked at the water moving south in the dark toward the harbor, slow and black and without hurry. Then he buttoned his coat and walked back toward the street. Fear that lasts is always worth more than blood that dries. The east corridor of Bellevue Hospital at 4:15 in the morning. The smell came back before the doors were fully open: bleach, antiseptic, and underneath both of them that sweetness: burned tissue, damaged flesh. The smell that no amount of cleaning solution fully eliminates because it comes from something the building itself has absorbed, the way old wood absorbs smoke. Over years of receiving people who arrived before dawn with no names and no explanations. A gurney came through the entrance fast. 2 men walking alongside it who did not go to the desk, did not give names, did not stop moving until the gurney was in the corridor and the night staff had taken over. Then they turned around and walked back out through the doors before anyone thought to follow them. The man on the gurney was conscious. His eyes were open. He was not screaming. In the ward. The night staff moved with the specific efficiency of people who had learned that certain arrivals at certain hours required action and not questions. The chart that opened under the fluorescent lights listed him with no full name and no explanation for what had been done to him. The official record, like the one opened 3 nights earlier, would say almost nothing. What happened to these men in the dark hours before they arrived here was not the hospital's business, and the hospital had long since accepted that fact. By 6 a.m., the Genovese family knew, not from a call Bumpy made, from a call that came into a specific apartment on Mulberry Street at 5:47 a.m. The man who answered listened for 9 seconds. Then he said 2 words. Then he ended the call. The family met before sunrise in a room that no investigator ever successfully identified or documented. They made a decision. They did not retaliate. That decision, the absence of an action, was itself the most significant event of the entire sequence. Everything that had happened before it, the sit-down, the pier, the hospital admission, had been building toward this moment. This was the moment that determined whether Bumpy's calculation had been correct. It had been correct. The men in that room understood what Bumpy had done and, more precisely, what he had not done. Vincent was alive. There was no body. There was no public incident that required a formal response. What existed was a man in a hospital bed and a message that had reached every person it was intended for with complete clarity. Retaliating meant acknowledging. Acknowledging meant formalizing. Formalizing meant sitting at a table with other families and explaining why their man had put his hand on Bumpy Johnson at a formal proceeding, and that explanation had no version that ended in their favor. It validated the original grievance. It confirmed that Vincent had acted without authorization. It opened questions they had no interest in opening. They took the only exit that cost them nothing further. They went silent. Vincent stayed 9 days in the ward. He was discharged on a Tuesday morning with paperwork that listed his injuries without explaining their origin, which was standard for a certain category of patient at this hospital in this era. He went somewhere after that. An account says New Jersey. Another says the Bronx, and he did not return to his previous position in the Genovese operation. No announcement was made. No one was informed officially. He simply stopped appearing in the rooms where he had previously appeared, and the rooms went on without him. And within 3 weeks his absence had become the default state of things, and no one marked the transition because there had been no single moment to mark. That was how removal worked in this world. Not a firing, not a public disgrace. A fading, gradual, collective, and total. The space you occupied closed over you without ceremony, and the organization continued, and the men who had worked alongside you found it easier to act as though you had never been there than to explain what had happened to you, and why. Vincent faded. The silence that surrounded his disappearance was itself a communication, the loudest possible confirmation that the Genovese family had received Bumpy's message, understood its terms, and chosen to absorb the outcome rather than contest it. In Harlem, the arrangement continued without interruption. The numbers operation ran. The percentages held. The weekly meetings happened on schedule. The men who needed to know what had occurred between a dinner table on 126th Street and a pier above the Hudson River knew. And they acted accordingly. And the neighborhood moved through the remainder of that autumn, held in shape by a structure that functioned exactly as it was supposed to function. Bumpy Johnson's name appeared in no newspaper that fall. No investigation. No official record of anything. But the knowledge moved through Harlem the way real knowledge always moved, not through print, not through law, but through the eyes of men who looked at each other on the street and understood without speaking what had been tested and what had held. The line was real. Everyone knew it now. And in a world where the only law that actually governed daily life was the law that people believed would be enforced, that knowledge was worth more than anything written in any courthouse downtown. The ward went quiet. The corridor smelled like bleach and old walls in the coming winter. Outside, Harlem kept moving. It always did. Winter hit Harlem in November 1953, like something that had been waiting outside the door all year. It came in off the river fast and cold and mean, the kind of cold that got into your chest when you breathed and sat there. Ice on the sidewalks by morning. Steam rising from the grates in the street, white and thick, gone in second. People moved with their shoulders up and their chins down and their hands buried in their pockets. The specific walk of a neighborhood that had learned to keep moving no matter what the weather was doing. Bumpy Johnson walked with his coat open at the collar. He always had. It was not a performance. It was not a statement he made consciously on any given morning when he got dressed. It was simply how he moved through the world unhurried, unguarded in appearance. His body language communicating something that his mouth never needed to say out loud. The scar was fully visible. Left side of his face, temple to jaw. The skin there had changed permanently tighter in some areas, with a waxy shine that normal skin doesn't carry, slightly pulled at the corner of his eye in a way that made that eye look like it had seen more than the other one. It was not a small mark. It was not something you could miss or pretend not to see. He did not cover it, did not grow anything on his face to obscure the lower half of it, did not turn away when people looked. He let it exist completely, openly, in the light of every room he walked into. The first time he went back to the barbershop on Lenox after November, the room went quiet for 3 seconds when he came through the door, not from fear, from recognition. The men in those chairs and against those walls looked at his face and read what was written there the way people in this neighborhood had always read the things that were written in places other than newspapers. Something had happened. He had been marked, and the man who marked him had subsequently learned what that cost. The scar was both halves of the story simultaneously, the wound and the reckoning, visible in the same piece of skin. Harlem understood. A city detective named Rollins started appearing in December. He was the patient kind, not aggressive, not loud, just present. He showed up at the barber shop. He sat in a car outside a restaurant on 125th Street for 2 hours one Tuesday and wrote in a small notebook with a blue cover. He stood on the corner of 118th Street one morning for 40 minutes in the cold, stamping his feet slowly, watching foot traffic with the expression of a man assembling a picture one piece at a time. Bumpy's people reported every sighting. He listened to each one and said very little. He was not afraid of Rollins. Fear of a detective was a reaction for men who hadn't expected scrutiny, and Bumpy had been expecting scrutiny since the 1930s. FBI field records from this period, documents that took decades to become available to researchers, show surveillance logs going back to 1948, noting the structure of the Harlem numbers operation. with the meticulous patience of an institution that understood it was building a case that might take years to close. History records the outline of men like Bumpy Johnson. It records the arrests, the court dates, the federal time served. What it cannot fully record is the interior of the thing, the calculations made in cold back rooms, the conversations that happened without witnesses, the decisions that shaped a neighborhood in ways that never appeared in any official document. One afternoon in late December, Rollins walked into the barbershop while Bumpy was in the chair. He came through the door and stood near it with his hat in his hand and looked at the room. His eyes moved to Bumpy, to the scar. He held his gaze there for a long moment, long enough that everyone in the room knew it was intentional, long enough that it was its own kind of statement. Bumpy looked at him in the mirror. He did not move his head, did not change his expression, did not signal anything to anyone in the room. He simply looked at Rollins in the mirror the way you look at something that is present and not going anywhere and not requiring any immediate response. Rollins stood there for 15 seconds. Then he put his hat on and walked out. The barber's scissors picked up exactly where they had left off. The radio filled the room again. Someone shifted in a waiting chair. The smell of hair oil and talcum powder and the faint sweetness of the heating unit running in the corner settled back into the normal texture of the room. 15 seconds of stillness. That was the cost of the moment. Power that needs to announce itself is power that isn't sure it's real. The real kind sat in a barber's chair with an open collar and let a city detective stare at its face for 15 seconds, and then went back to whatever it was doing before the detective arrived. The scar caught the winter light differently at different times of day. In the mornings on Lenox Avenue, when the low sun came in from the east at an angle, it had a shine to it that made it visible from further away than you might expect. People saw it from half a block. They noted it and they kept walking, and the noting of it was the point. It said I took the worst someone was willing to do to me. It said I'm still here. It said the man who did this is not. Rollins kept coming. The notebook kept filling. The file on East 69th Street kept growing. Bumpy kept wearing the scar in the open winter light and letting it say everything that needed to be said without his mouth ever having to form a single word. Visibility was a weapon and a liability at the same time. He had always known that. He carried both sides of it on his face every day, and he did not flinch from either one. That was the only kind of strength that lasted. The years moved through Harlem the way years always move, faster than you expect them to, slower than you want them to, leaving marks on everything they touch. 1954, 1955. Then the decade turned and turned again. The arrangement between Harlem and the Genovese family held. Not warmly, there was nothing warm about it. There never had been. It held the way scar tissue holds, tough and functional and slightly different from what was there before the wound. Both sides understood the new terms without ever sitting down to formalize them. The lesson of November 1953 had gone deep enough that it didn't need to be repeated. No second incident occurred. That absence, 15 years of no second incident, was itself the most significant evidence that what Bumpy had done on Pier 57 had worked precisely as intended. In a world where men tested each other constantly, where the lines were always being pushed at from multiple directions simultaneously, 15 years of stillness at a specific boundary was not an accident. It was the result of something. Bumpy ran the operation through the late 1950s and into the 1960s with the same cold consistency that had defined him since the 1930s. He was arrested. He did federal time Alcatraz in the 50s, other facilities in other years. Court records and federal prosecution files from this period document the repeated attempts by law enforcement to dismantle what he had built, and they document something else as well, that the structure survived his absence each time, functioning through periods of incarceration with a continuity that frustrated the investigators who had expected removal of the man to mean removal of the system. He had built it to outlast individual circumstances. It did. He came back each time into a Harlem that had changed while he was gone and found the essential things still intact. The numbers still running. The arrangements still holding. The neighborhood still operating under the system of rules that he had spent decades establishing through exactly the kind of precise, calibrated action that November 1953 had demonstrated. The 1960s were different. The civil rights movement had changed the language of the country and the specific gravity of Harlem within it. The neighborhood that had once existed in a kind of separate operational reality governed by its own systems, tolerated by the wider city as long as it remained self-contained, was now at the center of a national conversation about what Black Americans were owed and what they were willing to accept instead. Bumpy was 60 years old in 1965. He moved slower. The knee ached consistently now, not just in cold rooms. His heart had been making its dissatisfaction known in ways he acknowledged privately and discussed with almost no one. The men around him saw it. They said nothing because saying it required acknowledging what came after it, and none of them were prepared to have that conversation yet. He kept working, kept showing up, kept moving through the neighborhood with the coat open and the scar visible and the eyes steady. Because the moment he stopped doing that was the moment the space he occupied became available to whoever wanted it badly enough to take it. He was not going to make it available. By 1968, the heart was a serious problem. People who were close to him in the final months later described a man who was slowing in ways that couldn't be entirely accounted for by age. A tiredness that went deeper than physical. The specific exhaustion of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and was beginning to feel the full weight of the years it had taken. He was 62 years old. He had survived Alcatraz and federal prosecution and 30 years of operating in a city that had put most of the men who tried to do what he did into the ground before they turned 50. No bullet had found him. No knife. No rival's plan had closed around him completely enough to finish what it started. On July 7, 1968, he sat down for dinner at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street. The place smelled like fried food and coffee and the good particular warmth of a kitchen that had been running all day. The kind of smell that meant a normal evening. A meal with no special significance, in a room he had eaten in dozens of times before. His heart stopped between the table and whatever came next. He was pronounced dead before the ambulance reached the hospital. The man who had controlled fire for 30 years was ended not by any enemy's decision, but by the simple biological limit that applies to every human body, regardless of what that body has survived. Even the men who understand everything about power cannot negotiate with their own selves indefinitely. That is the final lesson, and it comes for everyone at a different hour. But it comes without exception, without regard for reputation or for the depth of the marks you have left on the city that made you. The city kept moving. It always did. The heat on 132nd Street on the day of the funeral was the kind that made the air above the asphalt shimmer and bend. New York in July smells like hot garbage and exhaust and concrete that has been absorbing sun since 6 in the morning. And that day it smelled like all of those things simultaneously, and nobody moved and nobody complained, and the street outside the funeral home was full before the doors opened. People stood 3 and 4 deep on the sidewalk. Men in dark suits with sweat soaking through their collars. Women in black dresses standing completely still in the heat. Old people who had been in Harlem since before the war. Young people who had grown up inside the system Bumpy had built without ever meeting the man who built it and wouldn't have been able to explain, if you asked them, exactly why they felt the need to be here. They were here because being here meant something. Politicians came. Community figures came. Ministers. People whose entire relationship with Bumpy Johnson existed in the above-ground world of churches and block associations and neighborhood organizations stood 10 feet from people whose relationship with him was considerably more complicated and considerably less available for public discussion. Both groups sweated in the same July heat. The two men in the sedan across the street were FBI. Everyone knew it. They didn't try very hard to look like anything else, which was either laziness or a deliberate signal that the surveillance did not end at death. The field office on East 69th Street had been building its file on Ellsworth Johnson for more than 2 decades. It was not going to stop because the subject was in a box. Inside the funeral home, it smelled like lilies going warm and candle wax and the heavy closeness of too many people in a room with insufficient air. The casket was at the front. Closed. The scar that Harlem had been reading for 15 years was no longer visible to anyone in the room. People said what people say. They talked about strength, about community, about a man who had been present in this neighborhood for 30 years in ways that shaped it permanently. They used careful language that acknowledged what could be acknowledged and built deliberate silence around everything else. Nobody mentioned the pier. Nobody mentioned the East Corridor of Bellevue at 4 a.m. Nobody mentioned the basement on 114th Street, or the sit-down on 126th Street, or the hand that had been placed on the wrong arm, and the 72 hours of cold calculation that had followed it. The silence around those things was the most honest tribute the room could offer. After the funeral, the structure held for a while on the momentum Bumpy had built into it, the way a gyroscope holds its orientation after you stop spinning it. Stable for a period and then gradually, incrementally, beginning to wobble. The numbers operation fragmented within 2 years. The arrangement with the Genovese family was renegotiated by men who had not spent 15 years building the specific credibility that had made the original terms possible. And the new terms reflected that difference. New organizations moved into the spaces. The heroin trade, which Bumpy had reportedly refused to involve himself with, in his later years a refusal documented in accounts from people who worked alongside him, expanded rapidly through Harlem after 1968 and did to the neighborhood what he had spent 3 decades trying to prevent any single destabilizing force from doing. It tore through it, house by house, block by block. The specific violence of it was different from the violence of the world he had run, less calculated, less structural, more random in who it destroyed. Families, children, the ordinary people who had lived inside his system without choosing to and without being asked. Harlem absorbed it. Harlem absorbed everything. That was the thing about this neighborhood that neither its enemies nor its chroniclers ever fully understood. It was not fragile. It bent under things that would have broken other places, and it did not break. It changed shape, and it kept going. But the Harlem of 1972 was not the Harlem of 1967. The lines that Bumpy had drawn and enforced and bled for and built into the memory of the neighborhood through 30 years of precise and deliberate action, those lines had moved. Some of them had disappeared entirely. This story does not ask you to mourn that. It asks you only to see it clearly, to understand what was built, how it was built, what it cost to build it, and what happened to it when the man who built it was gone. Not to celebrate the building of it, not to condemn it, to see the mechanism, to understand how a system of power actually functions, how it actually sustains itself, and what its actual relationship is to the people who live inside it. The sedan across the street drove away in the afternoon heat. The flowers inside were brown by Friday. The walls of Harlem, the specific understanding of where the lines had been and what it had meant to cross them, held longer than the flowers. But not forever. Power is not permanent. It is duration. It is the length of time between when you build something and when it comes apart without you. Bumpy Johnson built something that lasted 15 years past its hardest test and outlasted him by several more before it changed beyond recognition. In this city, in this world, in this business that was not nothing, that was almost everything. Wells Restaurant. July 7th, 1968. Bumpy Johnson sat down for dinner and never stood back up. Not a bullet, not a betrayal, Just a heart that finally ran out of what it had been running on for 62 years. Stubbornness, calculation, and the cold weight of 3 decades spent holding a line that nobody else would hold. The funeral filled the street. Nobody mentioned the pier. Nobody mentioned the hospital at 4 a.m. They didn't need to. The scar on his face said everything the room couldn't. This story doesn't ask you to admire him. It asks you to understand what happens when a boundary gets tested in a world where the law arrives late or never. Harlem survived him, because the rules he burned into this city went deep enough that even his absence couldn't erase them. If stories like this power, silence, and the deals made in rooms history almost forgot are what bring you back, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more rooms to open. And tell us below, do you think Bumpy made the right call staying silent at that table, or should he have acted the moment the Vincent's hand landed? We'll see you in the next story.